The following podcast is a Scrum Inc. production.
Welcome back to the Agile CEO. I'm JJ Sutherland, the CEO of Scrum Inc. Normally on the show, we have leaders and CEOs and generals and all that kind of stuff talking about how they're changing their organizations. And this season, I'm doing a little bit. I'm talking to some people who are actually looking at how people actually work, how they talk to each other, how they organize themselves, instead of just how they talk about it, like what they actually do. And it's a real honor to be joined by Charles Duhigg. Charles Duhigg is the author of bestselling books, Habit, Smarter, Faster, Better, the New York Times for many years, Pulitzer Prize winner, and now the writer of the New Yorker. His latest book is called Supercommunicators, How to Unlock the Secret Language of Connection. Charles, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me on.
So I'm just going to start right here. When was the last time you cried in front of someone?
So the question that you're pointing to there is a question from what's a fast friends procedure, when two research psychologists wanted to try and figure out if they could come up with a system that would make any strangers into friends. And what they found is that if people asked each other a series of 36 questions of escalating intimacy, right? The first question is, if you could have dinner with anyone in the world, who would it be with? And the second to last question is, when's the last time you cried in front of another person? That if they did this, that people felt very close to each other, even if they had almost nothing in common.
And so in Supercommunicators, one of the things you're getting at is that it's like, how do people actually connect? And one of the things you really hit on is what kind of conversation is happening. And that's sort of this emotional state and mimicking. I was wondering if you could just get into what Supercommunicators do differently than certainly the rest of us.
Yeah. So what we're sort of living through this golden age of understanding communication for the first time in a really profound sense because of advances in neuroscience and data collection and neural imaging. We can really see what's happening inside people's brains as they're having a discussion. And one of the things that we've realized is that when we're in a discussion, we think we know what that discussion is about, right? We think we're talking about, the budget for next year, where to go on vacation, or what happened today. But actually, if we look inside people's brains, what we see is that while they're in that discussion, they're having many different kinds of conversations. And these kinds of conversations, they tend to fall into one of three buckets. There are these practical conversations where we're making plans together or we're solving problems. But then there's also emotional conversations where I tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize. And then finally, there's social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other, how we relate to society, the identities that are important to us. And what researchers have found is that all three of these conversations are all equally important and legitimate. And in fact, in a discussion, you'll probably move from conversation to conversation without even realizing it. But what they also discovered is that if two people are talking to each other and they're not having the same kind of conversation at the same moment, they have real trouble hearing each other. They have a lot of trouble feeling connected to each other. And this has become known within psychology as the matching principle. And what it says is that successful communication requires having the same kind of conversation at the same moment. And that once we become aligned, then we can move from practical to emotional, back to practical, and then to social together. And we feel connected to each other.
One example that you used in the book, which I thought was really telling, that I think a lot of leaders and everybody can really relate to, is when Dr. Peter Hotez was talking about giving vaccines to children during the COVID vaccine and how he really had to change how he was communicating with the people he was talking to.
Yeah, absolutely. Because what would happen is that parents would come in who were vaccine resistant, right? They either were mistrustful of the science, or they had read something online that worried them, or they were mistrustful of authority. And I think as a scientist, any physician's instinct is to say, no, let me show you the evidence, right? I have all these studies that show that this vaccine is safe. This vaccine will protect your child from really serious disease. The problem is that the people were often coming in having an emotional conversation, saying, I'm worried, I'm anxious, I feel distrustful. And instead of matching that emotional conversation, the physician was launching immediately into a practical conversation. Okay, let me tell you the data and the evidence and the science. And what they found is that in a situation like that, you literally can't hear each other, right? Even though it appears like the parents are listening closely, they're not actually hearing what the doctor is saying, because all that they're doing is sort of arguing with him in their head or saying, why doesn't this guy like understand what I'm worried about? And so what's really, really important, and this has become sort of the way that things happen now in dealing with vaccine-resistant populations, is to meet them where they are and have the kind of conversation they want to have. If they come in and they're talking about being worried and anxious and upset, then you start by saying, look, I hear your anxiety and I totally understand, because I have felt those own anxieties myself about my own kids, right? If you're a parent, it's really, really natural to feel worried and concerned and to be distrustful of people who you haven't met just because someone says they're an expert. If you don't mind, would it be okay for me to tell you what some of the science says that convinced me to put those worries aside, right? What the physician's actually doing in that situation is he's asking permission, or she, do I have your permission to move from an emotional conversation to a practical conversation? Now that we've sort of like connected on this emotional level, do I have your permission to start moving into a practical conversation? When they do that, they find that their rate of success goes up significantly.
So I think that is something, that kind of pattern of someone in authority saying, well, I'm an authority and I've thought about this a lot and I actually do have data. And something that I see sometimes leaders struggle with is they don't know what kind of conversation they're having with their own teams or the people that report to them. So what would your advice be to try to know what kind of conversation to be having?
Yeah. So the most important thing you can do is to ask questions. And there's a certain kind of question that's known as a deep question that gets people talking about their values or their beliefs or their experiences. Now, I'll mention when teachers learn to do this, like this is part of standard teacher training, is they're taught, if a student comes up to you and they have something they want to talk about, start the conversation by asking them, do you want to be helped? Do you want to be hugged? Or do you want to be heard? Which of course is the practical, the emotional, and the social, right?
Right.
And and for little kids, like if you ask them that question, they'll actually tell you immediately what they want, right? They'll say something like, no, I don't need you to do anything, but I just want you to know that Jimmy's being mean to me, right? They know what the kind of conversation they want to have. With adults, it's a little bit harder because you can't ask someone, particularly in a workplace setting, do you want to be hugged? Like that's not going to go over well. And so the answer is to ask more questions. One of the things we know about supercommunicators, and we're all supercommunicators at one time or another, but consistent supercommunicators, they tend to ask 10 to 20 times as many questions as the average person. And many of those questions are asking deep questions. They're asking about values, beliefs, and experiences. And that can sound kind of intimidating, right? But it's as simple as if you meet someone who's a doctor, instead of saying, oh, what hospital do you work at? Asking them, oh, what made you decide to go to medical school? Right? That second question, that gives someone an opportunity. It's an invitation to talk about something more meaningful and real. And so the first thing that I would say to leaders is start those meetings by asking a question. What does this job mean to you? What is it about this job that you're passionate about? What are you mentioned to me that you're a little anxious. Tell me about those anxieties and tell me why they're important to you. That person's gonna basically tell you at that point what type of mindset they're in, whether it's a practical, emotional, or social mindset. And you're gonna have so much more information to use in helping that conversation move forward.
Yeah, in my work, one of the things I do is I talk to a lot of senior leaders, and I say like, why is my organization working? And I sort of say, well, explain to me what's hard. Like, just what's hard about working in your organization? What's like hard to get stuff done? And they'll usually have 45 minutes of just, this is why I can't stand this. I can't stand this. And I look at them and I say, I'm talking to the CEO here. Why is that okay? And sort of like try to get at the permission they're giving the organization to give them a sense of agency.
Yeah. No, I think those are great questions, because what you're really asking is, what are the things you care about, right? Yeah. If there's something hard and you're banging your head against it, it must matter to you. Why does it matter to you? Why is this important? How does this fit into how you see yourself and how you see the world and the things that you hope to do with your life?
So in your books, you've sort of really been looking at systems. It seems to me, this is, you can tell me if I'm wrong, in the Smarter, Faster, Better and the Power of Habit is like, what are the systems that surround people? Like, what is the system of a team?
Yeah.
What is the system of how we habitually do something or gain new habits or break bad ones? Do you think that there's a through line into sort of the systemization of, at the end of your book, you say, okay, here's the things you should do. Know what kind of conversation you're in, what the goals of the conversation, you have a few steps. And I was wondering, do you see that's the systemic nature of your work as a through line?
So here's the thing I think about systemization. I think systemization is really helpful in that it helps us identify discrete elements of a process that otherwise we live through, right? So if I tell you, okay, here's the recipe to make cookies. Right. The first time you make cookies, you're going to follow that recipe pretty closely.
Right.
Because you don't know all the discrete elements that make a cookie into something that tastes good. You need guidance. But the thing is, by the time you're a great baker, by the time you're 30th or 40th or 100th time making those cookies, you're actually going to deviate from the recipe a little bit, right? The recipe is going to be a guideline, a framework to help you remember certain things. But the point of that system was to teach you what is important to pay attention to. And I think the same thing is true if we look at people who use, whether it's agile systems or other systems that use them in very sophisticated ways. What we see is the system, this systemization, the process, the framework, that becomes increasingly less valuable over time, except as a way to remind people to think more deeply about the choices that they're making at this particular moment. And within psychology, these are known as cognitive routines, basically mental habits that we get into that allow us to think more deeply, particularly when thinking deeply is hard, right? When we're under pressure or we're feeling overwhelmed, or when something has become so rote and boring that we don't even want to pay attention to it anymore and we just kind of go on autopilot. We need systems, we need habits that help remind us, okay, it's really easy not to think right now, but just take a second to think a little bit more deeply about this. And that's what frameworks do. Frameworks create these little moments when we're asked to pay attention again. That doesn't mean that the framework is right, and it doesn't mean following the framework gets you to the best solution. It means that learning the framework empowers you to have a more sophisticated understanding of whatever you're pursuing.
Right. No, I completely agree with you. I often will hear people explain agile frameworks or some other framework to people. They're like, "Oh, that just seems obvious. That's the way people should work." And I'm like, "Yes. Do you do it?"
Right.
And they're like, "No." And I was like, "Well, just put in these habitual things in your book on habits. Like, okay, every 2 weeks we're going to get together and talk about how are we doing as a team.
Right.
Let's just talk about it because you should."
Yeah. And once a week you're going to clear your desk for 30 minutes and not do email and just look at the calendar for the week ahead and figure out what's the most important thing to get done and what do you need to prepare for. We all build these cognitive routines into our lives. The difference with the most successful people is that they're much more deliberate about it. They're much more deliberate about figuring out, when does my ability to think deeply, when does it break down? What do I need to do in that moment to be able to remind myself that I need to just take 30 seconds and think a little bit more about this choice before I hit send on that email, or I, whatever it is that I'm about to do, or hit the order button. How do I slow myself down just briefly so that I can think more deeply? That's a habit. Right.
And with communicators, it was listening. It was funny. I was listening to your book and I read part of it. It's really a great book, by the way. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thanks.
There's this one part where you were describing about, I think it was the story about the intelligence agent that was doing really poorly at recruiting spies.
Right.
And he talked about how he would just ask all these questions and he got better at it after failing many times and learning through an iterative process. But I remember listening to it and saying, I just want to cut to the chase. If I was in the situation, I would make the exact same mistakes he was making. What was interesting was hearing you tell his story of learning to slow down and listen.
Right.
And I wonder if you could just say, what is listening? Because it's the way you described it was a revelation to me. It's like, that totally makes sense, but I hadn't thought about it that way before.
Yeah. And this slowing down is really important. It's worth noting, I've written 3 books now and these guides come out, someone else will publish a guide Supercommunicators in 30 pages. And what they're kind of missing is the point that the rest of the pages aren't there just to fill up the space between the covers. Right. Oftentimes when we're trying to learn a big idea, The only way we can fully grasp it is by being introduced to it through different ways, right? So here's a narrative that explains the idea. Here's some like didactic instruction on how the idea works. Here's some scientific research on the idea. It's only once we get all of these different vantage points on it that we actually understand the idea. And you're exactly right. A big part of that is listening when we're in conversation with other people. The person you mentioned, Jim Lawler, was a CIA officer, and he was posted to Europe, and it was his job to recruit foreign nationals to become spies for the US. And what he found was that the only way he could actually connect with someone, I mean, if you're asking someone to be a spy, like to share secrets with you, you're basically asking them to like potentially commit suicide, right? Like this is like the riskiest thing on the face of the planet. Why would anyone do this? Why would you go back to Iran and like send secrets to the CIA? So how do you persuade people to do this? Well, what Lawler found was that, he would offer them money. He would tell them stories about America and how great it is and how we want to make the world safer. None of that worked.
Right.
What worked is that when he was honest and vulnerable about himself, and then he listened closely to what the other person had to say, and he matched their honesty and their vulnerability with his own honesty and vulnerability, that's when he was able to connect with them. That's when they began to hear each other and really be persuaded by each other. And there's an important note to this, which is we tend to think of listening as a passive activity, right? I close my mouth and I open my ears. And that's an important component of listening, but that's not all of what listening is. The other part of listening is proving to the other person that I'm paying attention to them, that I'm listening to them. And we do that by asking follow-up questions, by repeating back what we heard them say, by making reference to things that they said earlier in the conversation. We have to prove that we are listening for the other person to really believe that we are.
I think that is really an important point, because it's so easy to say, I'm listening, I'm listening, but it's not like, what did you mean? And one of the places in your book that you talk about this is when there's a conflict in people with polarized views on a topic, there's conflict, and you talk about gun control and the debate there. And actually, the last time I cried in front of somebody was there was a school shooting near my kids' school a couple of years ago.
Oh no!
And I had to go get them out. No one was hurt, thank God. But about 6 months later, I was talking to a politician, and the kids were having a lockdown drill, and I was describing when my children were asking me about the lockdown drill at the local public school. And I didn't even expect it. I mean, I was like, and it just started crying. It was just.
I imagine you felt like frustrated and powerless and like just unable to protect your kids. Is that kind of what you were feeling?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, because I'm used to being, I'm a CEO. I've done well in my life. I've done a lot of really interesting things, and this is something I have zero control over. Yeah. And the most important thing in my life, protecting my kids, there's sort of like this storm that just seems madness, and that I can't do anything about it. I can't do anything. And so I thought a lot about that during that conversation. And I was wondering if you could just sort of talk about how that worked because you interviewed some people, some who were, very pro Second Amendment, who were very pro gun control, and how they could actually have a conversation, which I think is critically important, especially in our country in this time with such a polarized country that we have right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. So there was this experiment that was done just a handful of years ago, where they brought together about 20 gun control advocates and about 20 gun rights activists, right? So people who see the issue of guns completely differently. And the goal of the experiment was not to get them to convince each other that the other person is wrong and they're right? Like that's not going to happen. The goal was to see if they could have a civil conversation with each other, if it was possible to bridge this divide and get people to at least talk in a way where everyone walked away saying, I'm really glad I had that conversation. And so what they did is before they started the conversations, they trained them in a number of techniques. One of them is a technique that we now call looping for understanding. And it's a way of proving that we're listening. And it has these 3 steps. The first step is you ask a deep question, right? You ask a question like, can you tell me a little bit about why guns are so important to you? Or what's your earliest memory of guns? Or, when you think about guns, what's the feeling that you feel, right? So just ask a question. Then listen really closely to what the person is saying in response. In fact, listen so closely enough that you can do step 2, which is tell them in your own words what they just said, right? Don't mimic them. The goal here is not mimicry. The goal is to say, what I heard you say is that when you think about guns, you think about hunting with your dad, and it was the closest you've ever felt to him, and that you want to have that experience with your own kids, right? That's step 2. And most of us will do this. Most of us do step 1 and step 2 pretty intuitively. It's step 3 that at least I often forget, which is after I have described what I heard you say, I ask you if I got it right. Did I hear you correctly? Am I understanding what you were trying to tell me? Because in that moment, what I'm actually doing is I'm asking you for permission to acknowledge that I was listening. And if you acknowledge that I was listening, you become anywhere from 10 to 15 times more likely to listen to me in return. And so what's really, really important is to use techniques like this, particularly in conflict conversations, particularly in conversations where we might disagree with each other, there might be some tension, because in the back of my head while I'm talking is going to be the suspicion, you're not actually listening to me, you're just waiting your turn to speak. And if you can prove to me that you're not just waiting your turn, if you can prove to me that you're paying attention, then I'm going to be so much more willing to pay attention to you.
Yeah. I mean, that's really remarkable. I was reading your book a little while ago. I was at West Point for Veterans Day. And I got a tour from the former commandant of West Point. And at one of the academic halls, there are these 2 cannon, one on either side of the door. And it's called the Alpha and the Omega. And one cannon is the first cannon that shot the first shot at Fort Sumter. And the other cannon is the one that shot the last shot at Appomattox.
Oh, wow.
And the cadets have to go by. And right after that, so that was really a West Point war, because apparently there are like 55 some odd major conflicts, and like 50 of them West Point graduates run commanding both sides.
Yeah.
And so then there's this one guy who, I believe this might be too good to check, but was the guy who surrendered Fort Sumter. He started the West Point Graduates Association because he said, okay, the war's over. How are we going to talk to each other again? And so I was listening to your book and thinking about it on the train ride up to New York. And it's sort of like, I was just sort of imagining, like, what must those conversations have been like?
Yeah.
And how hard that must have been.
I'm sure, right? And the truth of the matter is that, like, that's a particularly extreme example, but we all have hard conversations like that. We all sit down with someone whom we might disagree with politically, we might disagree with at work, we might just see the world differently, and we have to get along with each other.
Right.
And what's interesting is, if you think about it, there is not one person on this planet that you agree with 100%. Like, if I was to sit you and your spouse down, there's plenty of things that you disagree on. And yet those disagreements do not destroy your relationship, right? You manage to kind of make pleasant conversation every single day and still love each other. And so I think that there's an important realization here, which is the goal of conversation is not for you and me to agree with each other. The goal of conversation is for you and me to feel connected to each other and to understand how each other sees the world a little bit. Right. So when I sit down to have conversations with you, or if I'm the Union general talking to the Confederate general, my goal is not to try and convince you that the Union was right or the Confederacy was wrong. My goal is to understand how you see the world a little bit and to speak in such a way that you can understand how I see the world. And even if we walk away still disagreeing with each other, you still think the South should be an independent country, and I think that keeping the Union together was the right choice. Even if we walk away disagreeing with each other, if we understand each other a little bit better, we feel connected. And it turns out that this connection is actually the entire reason why communication evolved. We think of communication as something that is an information transfer device. And that's a really nice side benefit of communication. But the reason why communication originally evolved was because of a pro-social instinct that evolved within our brains. Human beings have a desire, a need to feel connected to other human beings. Because without that connection, we can't build families or villages or countries or militaries, right? Or companies, that need for connection is fundamental to the human psyche. And the way that we feel connected is through communication. Think about how many conversations you have where it's not about information transfer. When you see your spouse and you ask them, how was your day? My guess is you're not really curious about how did that meeting go today, right? Like exactly what happened. What you're doing is you're asking a question to create that sense of connection. And the nice thing is that we can have that connection without having to agree with each other 100%.
Yeah, and the last part of where you're talking about conversation, you're talking about like who we are kind of conversations. Like what are the overlaps? What are the Venn diagram? The West Point can be, okay, we both went to West Point. We both served in the Army. And I was thinking about, doing this interview with you, and I was like, okay, we were both in Daily Journal. I worked for NPR for a long time, and you were at the New York Times. So, we both were Daily Journal. We've both written books. So we have this sort of overlapping identity that we can connect on. And having those conversations can be incredibly difficult. And just mapping that out can be incredibly powerful.
They can be really difficult. They can also be really wonderful and not difficult, right? So I think particularly, I think when we think about a social conversation or an identity conversation, we think that it's really difficult. Usually it's because of one of two things. Either we're worried of saying the wrong thing, right? I'm going to say something and someone else is going to get offended. Or I'm worried that someone else is going to say something and I get offended, right? And that this offense is going to make it impossible for us to really connect with each other. And it's just going to create tension, make my stomach kind of upset. So what do we know about avoiding that? Well, oftentimes when that offense occurs, it's because I'm pushing you or you're pushing me into an identity that we're not choosing to be a part of. Like if I said, oh, JJ, as a white man, you really don't understand what it's like to live the life of anyone in this country who's not white. Well, basically what I've done is I've told you, I'm going to push you into this identity of someone who's ignorant about the life experiences of everyone who's not like yourself.
Right.
Now, the truth of the matter is the fairest thing I could say is to say, JJ, I know that you're a white man, right? But I also know that you're a journalist and you spend a lot of time talking to people who are unlike you. And I know that you're someone who cares about the world. And so you probably have neighbors that, again, are different than you, but you're talking to them. And by the way, you're also a man, right? You don't know what it's like to be a woman, but you probably have a lot of women in your life that you talk to on a regular basis. You might be a husband, you might be a brother, you might be a father to daughters. What I'm doing there is instead of assigning you to one identity, I'm recognizing the multitude of identities that you possess, because we all contain multitudes. And the way to make those identity and those social conversations easier is to acknowledge none of us is just one thing. When I give you the space and the goodwill, the grace to convey who you are in all of your multitudes and all of your complexities, what I'm doing is instead of forcing you into a corner, instead of engaging in what's known as identity threat, I'm inviting you to tell me who you are. And once we do that, it's very, very unlikely that we'll have that tension. Because once I see you as a complicated person and you see me as a complicated person, it tends to remove a lot of the anxiety around identity conversations.
And I just want to end here, because at the end of your book, you write about something that I wrote about in the end of my last book, is that connection, like the point of communication is this connection, as you're saying, with other people through multiple identities. And that is actually, in terms of the health and vitality of a human life, is one of the most important things.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We know this from study after study, right? And in fact, there's one of the most famous studies is known as the Harvard study of adult development. It was originally known as the Grant study, where they followed thousands of people around their entire lives. They would talk to them every 2 years. And their goal was to try and figure out what causes someone as they get older to be happy and healthy and successful. And what they discovered, they looked at all kinds of things, right? It started at Harvard. So they're like, if you went to Harvard, you're probably definitely going to be happy, healthy, and successful. Turns out that's not true, right? It started in the 1930s. And so they just assumed that anyone who got married and stayed married, that would make them happy, healthy, and successful. No, it doesn't. There's actually only one thing that they discovered could consistently consistently predict health, happiness, and success at age 65. And that's having at least a handful of close relationships at age 45. Because if you have close relationships at age 45, you've probably had them for a while, and you're going to continue to have them for a while.
Right.
You know, the U.S. Surgeon General has said being lonely is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. 15 cigarettes a day is a lot of cigarettes, right? That's not just like casual cigarettes. That's someone who's like, I definitely want to get lung cancer. Like, and being lonely is the same thing. We know that if you have connections with other people, and if you nurture those connections, that you will be healthier as you move through life. You'll certainly be happier. And it turns out you'll be more successful because oftentimes they make you aware of opportunities that you didn't otherwise know existed. And the way that we feel close to other people, the way that we maintain those relationships is through conversations. And that does not mean you have to talk to someone every week. It doesn't even mean you have to talk to them every month. But there is probably someone in your life that you love or feel really good about, or you like them, and you haven't talked to them in 6 months or 12 months or 18 months. And what you should do is pick up the phone and give them a call. And the reason you haven't done it yet is because you're worried that it's going to be awkward, right? You forgot their wife's last name. You can't remember how many kids they have. And it is. It's going to be awkward for the first minute, maybe the first 90 seconds. But then as soon as you're out of that, it's going to feel fantastic. And you're going to hang up the phone and you're going to say, oh my God, I'm so glad I called that guy. Like, I hadn't talked to him in forever, and it's just so wonderful to hear how he's doing. That is how we help ourselves and help the world.
That is something I'm going to do. There's a good friend of mine, Lulu, who I have not talked to in about a year for no real reason.
Right.
And and I was just saying, I really got to talk to her. But Charles Duhigg, thank you so much. Charles Duhigg's latest book is Supercommunicators, How to Unlock the Secret Language of Connection. It's highly recommended, and it's just full of insights and practical stuff. Charles, when talking to my wife this week, I've been like, okay, does she want to be heard? Does she want to be helped? Does she want to be hugged?
Yeah, it's great. It's great.
I've been doing that this week, and it's actually been really great. So thank you so much for your time, Charles.
Thank you, JJ. Really appreciate you having me.
The Agile CEO is brought to you by Scrum Inc. In today's fast-paced world, adaptability is key. Our expert consulting services tailor transformations that drive measurable success, creating resilient, high-performing organizations. Whether you're leading a team, managing an organization, or guiding enterprise-level change, we're here to support your journey. Transform with confidence and achieve the outcomes that matter. Learn more at scruminc.com.